Welcome to Beyond the Grave, where darkness and the unknown collide. Join us on a spine-tingling journey through the chilling realms of the supernatural. Prepare to be haunted by eerie tales, ghostly encounters, and the unexplained mysteries that lurk in the shadows. Subscribe now, if you dare, and let's unravel the secrets that lie beyond the grave together. Hope you would enjoy the 1-hour scary story compilation on our channel. Subscribe our channel, and press the bell icon for more disturbing and chilling scary stories. Whenever Gideon said something like, "This is going to be fucking awesome," the end result was, inevitably, disaster. But that was okay. Aiden loved disaster. So when Gideon showed up on that gleaming summer Thursday morning and asked if he wanted to do something, Aiden immediately said yes. The repetitive buzzing hum of the Arizona suburbs bothered him less when the boring reenactments of days prior were marred by the faint illicitness of Gideon's minor transgressions. "Where are we headed?" Aiden asked, forgetfully adding bitch at the end of his question. Their skateboards rattled past the identical houses. The mailboxes try out as extras for The Persistence of Memory in the Morning Sun. Swimming pools, Gideon didn't look around at all. I just stared straight ahead at the indistinct scenery. "Dude, fuck, you didn't say something. I don't just wear bathing suits under my shorts. We aren't swimming." "Then what about pools?" Gideon did a kick stop and then skated off, faster than Aiden could, without looking to see if he was following or saying anything. "God, I hate you, dude." He sped up, chasing his friend's rapidly disappearing frame. They rode to the bus stop. When the bus came, late and already crowded, they shuffled in, slipping in between the crowd to maneuver to the back. "Fucking hate riding the bus, man," mumbled Aiden. It was better before the routes got slashed to save money. They blamed it on unions and pensions, but that's not it. It's this economy. Man, it's not the economy. Everybody says that. Like these bus driver pensions, they are going to bankrupt the whole world. Because retired bus drivers live a life of unimaginable luxury, right? Laughed Aiden. Dudes drove buses for 30 years. Buses. For 30 years. And then they retire. And then the company starts complaining about their pensions. Dude, they knew how much the pension was going to cost. And so did the bus drivers. That's why they were bus drivers. This economy, though. I hate it when people say that. Because the economy got messed up, we should be fine with no pensions. No savings. No security. No jobs. Because why? We're those gifts. And we should have been grateful. But the fucking rich white dudes on top. No offense. None taken. Aiden's dad owned a construction business, which had done quite well during the housing boom. Now it was slowly going bankrupt and bleeding out. Most nights, he fell asleep to the sounds of his dad's beer cans opening. They sounded like gunshots or maybe distant storms. They stay just as rich. Fuck that. The bus lurched out of a red light. Gideon looked around. Our stop. Corners of Marx and Lenin. Intersection of Icepick and Trotsky, he said, reaching across the aisle and pulling the signal. Ding. They had drifted into another section of the suburbs. It looked exactly the same. The comfort of strangers' subdivisions, streetcars named Paxil. Now where? He asked. Left for, 5 minutes. They rode in silence, cars roaring past them. The sun continued rising. They had turned down Elmore Avenue with its no outlet sign and neighborhood sign, Shepperton Estates, and Gideon pulled up on his skateboard. Before the two of them, there was a long blank street of identical houses. This, motherfucker, is what we are doing today. Every single house on this block was foreclosed, and every single one has a completely empty swimming pool. The houses stood open and abandoned. Some had for sale signs still crooked in the glaring light. Others had just given up, with dead front yards and empty driveways. They all have pools. When the fuck did everyone think they were rich enough to buy pools? Middle-class people got all fucked up on some crazy bullshit and thought they were no-view riche and shit. I saw this on some skate sites. Dudes are going around the country, mapping abandoned areas. There are places in California where you can skate through like 20 miles of pools. Fuck yeah. Great recession. Right? One other thing. They were skulking up the driveway of the first house on the right. Aiden kept looking around, as if someone crazy was going to come out screaming to get off his lawn. But no, this was an ultra-modern boomtown after the boom. This was where the ghosts lived. In one of these houses, the whole family killed themselves rather than leave the house. They were all found in the pool. Oh, so there's that. They had woken up in the first backyard. Everything was desolate, yet it almost seemed like it was paused, like if someone hit a button, life would start again. But things weren't paused. Things were stopped. There's that. They skated through the swimming pools, gloriously empty. They jumped fences and dove into unlocked back doors. They ran laughing through wrecked McMansions, walls ripped up from copper wiring being ripped out. They threw rocks into windows and heard the glass sing back symphonies of supreme hymns. At the fifth house, the terminal point of the cul-de-sac, the rain came without warning. Raindrops like tiny wet bullets hit their still-breathing bodies. They rushed from the edge of the drained swimming pool to the shelter of the overhang. Dude, I didn't think it was supposed to rain. Aiden asked. Gideon had already pulled out his phone, staring intently into its screen. No. It says no rain for the rest of the week. It might be wrong. I know, but look. He held out his phone. It doesn't even say it's raining now. They watched the rain pelt the patio. Storms in the desert come on suddenly and seem to threaten to annihilate the entire world with their veracity. And then they vanish, never to be seen again. Aiden heard a sound over the rain and saw Gideon opening the sliding glass patio doors. He stood outside and listened to the splashing, and then heard Gideon call for him to come the fuck in. Immediately, he came in and stopped. The interior of the home was untouched, completely furnished. The kitchen fruit bowls teemed with apples, bananas, avocados, and oranges. The refrigerator was open. All the shelves were filled with perishable food items, cruelty-free eggs, grass-fed beef, and almond milk pictures on the wall. A happy family. Smiling dad. Smiling kids. Smiling mom. I thought these were empty. They are. The panic twisted Gideon's voice until his sentence rose almost an octave. That site said this, asterisked his empty. I think the site might not be completely right here, man. He was trying to keep his voice down, but he still half screamed. He and Gideon were arrested last year when the cops found them smoking pot in the mall parking lot. They were both on probation. Things had been so awkward. The real world of judges, lawyers, and probation officers pressed down with unbelievable precision against his chest. We have to get out, man. Somebody is obviously living here. We're breaking and entering. No, look. Man, was Gideon pulling out his phone? Was he launching Safari at a time like this? Let me show you. Thud. Oh my God. Aiden whispered. Thud. 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 Someone is upstairs. Let's get the fuck out. He turned and ran to the sliding glass door, which was now closed and locked. He could see the pool from where he was. It wasn't empty anymore. The raindrops pounded into the shimmering water of the somehow full pool. Adirondack chairs with beach towels over their backs encircled the pool. The towels had flamingos on them. Can you fucking not be fucking intellectually disabled? Gideon's little sister had Downs, and he was hypersensitive about the R word. About this shit. Open it. Thud. 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 The noise was coming from the staircase. Not opening. He hissed. Not opening. Gideon pushed him aside and grabbed the door. Nothing happened. The door stayed closed. The first stair croaked, groaned, and creaked. Thud. Gideon ran into the kitchen, grabbed a stool, and hurled it at the door. Aiden covered his face, and the stool bounced back and clattered on the tile floor. "Fuck," Gideon said. "Oh." And a body bounced down the staircase. Oh my God. The body barely resembled a body. An essential part of its identifiable humanity was missing, in the same way deer on the side of the road go from obviously being dead deer on the side of the road to becoming increasingly swollen, distorted, and then, finally, an unrecognizable burst red thing beside the median strip. A violent trace of history. The body was wearing a blue dress with red flowers on it. It had been dead for a long time. Water poured out of its mouth, ears, and the holes that used to be eyes. The water spread out and touched the stool, which still rattled. Thump. Jesus, 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 Jesus. Aiden couldn't tell if that was him or Gideon. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was something else speaking. Another body clattered down the stairs. And then another. Then, finally, all were swollen and discolored, as if they had been underwater too long. He stared at the hand of one of the smaller bodies, the way the fingers were so wrinkled that it looked like a twisted up and dead gray flower petal. And then the flower bloomed. The hand moved. The body stood up hesitantly and awkwardly, like a tourist in the subway. Unsure of where to walk or perhaps even how, the thing moved side to side. Fetid waters gurgled out of its feet. It pushed limp and wet blonde hair, matted and foul-smelling, away from its face. Whatever it used to be, it had long stopped being. The other three bodies had risen. They leaked, squelched, and moved with a hideous slowness. Aiden lost all sense of himself. He couldn't turn and look at Gideon. Was he even alive anymore? Had he hit his head and bled out in an empty pool? Was this hell? Was this a desperate hallucination in his dying brain? The drowned things surged all at once, as if they had latched onto a secret undertow and were being pulled by an invisible ocean. The bodies smelled of drowned cities and flooded worlds. They smelled of forgotten, wet horrors. The father thing brushed against him. He could smell it. He was touching it. The father's body was full of water and collapsed with contact, like blackened and rotten fruit. It groaned. Water ran from his toothless mouth, down his ruined and twisted neck, and onto Aiden's vans. Somehow, the door had opened, and they left the house and walked out, past Gideon and Aiden, and onto the patio. Watery trails followed them. The two watched from the kitchen, in the shadow of the stainless steel refrigerator. In the valley of the Viking Range, in the bosom of the god of the material world, as the parade of the dead reached the pool. At the edge of the pool, the malformed bodies pressed mutilated arms against deformed stumps. They stepped down, slowly, into the shallow end. And they began to make a terrible noise. The noise penetrated the house and reverberated in Aiden's ears. It was the sound of guilt, hunger, horror, fear, revulsion, and nausea in the world. At their imitation of existence, the screaming sounded like something Aiden had heard before, but he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember anything. They walked into the water. The screams grew louder. The raindrops pounded into their faces and cheeks. Chunks ripped off and splashed into the shallows. And then Aiden saw the change. The deeper they went into the water, the more decay faded from them. The boy had eyes again, instead of holes. The mother's lips turned red from gray. The father's torn and flooded clothes resembled khakis or Oxford shirts. The girl was suddenly awkward and tall and possessor of an immense and awful sadness that there was never to be anything else. The family moved into the pool, and the waters rose into them. The waters poured into their open mouths. The screaming stopped as their mouths filled, and they sank. Their arms and legs kicked, even after minutes underwater. The parents held the children down when they tried to swim away. And then, nothing. Bubbles stopped escaping from their mouths. The screaming. Aiden finally recognized the screaming. It was the same noise he would make in his dreams. The dreams he always forgot about upon waking, the dreams where he died the rain had stopped, like it had never been. The patio was dry and glimmered in the desert heat. The pool was empty, as drained as it had been before. The family was gone. Aiden finally looked at Gideon. Gideon was crying, and he realized, surprised, that he was too. "Let's get the fuck out of here. Fuck this forever." Gideon's words echoed over the broken tiles, through the empty house with its broken windows and cracked doors and giant aching holes on the walls where pictures should be of happy families smiling for the camera. There I was, sweating in my uncomfortable seat, surrounded by the sounds of obnoxious, unsynchronized clapping. Todd Howard had just made his usual appearance on the annual E3 Gaming Expo stage. The crowd was anxious, awaiting their anticipated announcements, ready to possibly be disappointed. Myself, I wasn't at the expo, enduring the claustrophobic mania for some video games. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good RPG every once in a while, but that wasn't my intention on the day in question. I was focused on Howard's body language, the glare in his eyes, looking for any subtle off-movements, even his choice of dialogue. There's been something bugging me for some time now that I have a firm and dedicated belief in. Todd and the company of Bethesda are, in fact, part of the secret cult. I know how crazy it sounds, but please just hear me out. Allow me to take you back to the traumatizing experience that started all of this. Orange, red, and yellow. The leaves brought an offset of color to an otherwise gloomy autumn day. The season also happened to be the prefix to the disc that was held in my hands, Fallout 4. I was a little late at having my try at the game, as I picked it up around November of last year. Still, I was pretty excited to give it a go. It has gained a lot of popularity after all. With the game on my 4-pounds console, I recall myself sitting on my bed for hours on end. I was fully absorbed into the wasteland-filled virtual environment, forgetting about the spilled cup of cola on the floor next to my feet and the fallen slice of pizza on my bed sheets. The real world around me was ultimately non-existent. It wasn't until my controller died that reality peeked through again. I, however, only used this moment of clarity to freak out and quickly plug in a charging cable between my system and controller. I had to hurry and jump back into the Fallout universe. This is where I felt like I was worth something. This is where I didn't feel alone. Fallout 4 was a game where I could build, fight, and help people in need. The settlement crafting system pulled me in, allowing me to create houses out of the resources I worked so hard for. Enemies that got in my way, I would fend off using practical weapons I made myself. On quests, I found mutants and irritated hostiles, the likes of which led me to achievements. These accolades made me feel great and wanted in this made-up reality. Finally, something made life livable that didn't happen to be prescription or recreational drugs. My virtual ecstasy, however, came to an abrupt halt. I began noticing some things out of the ordinary, even for a game of fantasy. I'd come up to these electronic terminals in the game and noticed some patterns. Whether I was in a shopping mall, a library, or a museum, the same word would pop up on the terminals, along with the rest of the text. I never really noticed until I saw it appear in multiples on some of the screens. The word that struck my attention was end. Most wouldn't bat an eye at this. I mean, the game is set in a post-apocalyptic world, so the word end is rather fitting. For one reason or another, it didn't feel fitting to me at all. I see this word pop up all the time throughout my life. Everyone has that magic number that seems to follow them everywhere they go, whether it's the lucky number 7 or the unlucky number 13. Well, mine is the word end. I see it inside gas stations, grocery stores, the daily newspaper, and even on cereal boxes. This word is constantly being thrown at me. As soon as I started noticing this, I decided to look at one more terminal in the game. I came across one that was fairly easy to get to. There wasn't much disturbance, just some destroyed cars, no enemies in sight. This terminal didn't seem unusual at first, with the same common words lit up on the monitor. Then something obstructed the screen. The entire thing filled up with my least favorite word, typed over and over. It sped up gradually, eventually to the point that my eyes couldn't keep up. I was wildly confused, wondering if this was just part of the video game. It was then that I turned off the game, not caring about where I was or when I last saved my progress. I was far too spooked to continue. Later that evening, I shared the experience with one of my close friends while hanging out at his house. I told him I finally gave the game a shot and mentioned what happened, hoping he wouldn't judge me and perhaps would know what I was talking about. My questions, to my dismay, were not answered. I've put hundreds of hours into Fallout 4, and that isn't anything I've witnessed in my playthroughs, he stated. This led me to believe that I had simply played the game for so long that it had taken a toll on my mental state. Somehow, this theory just made me feel worse. Walking back home that day, my phone kept ringing from all sorts of numbers, all of which I assumed were telemarketers, considering I didn't recognize the numbers. I ignored them for a while, but there was one I decided to finally answer. "Hello," I asked in a cautious tone. "Hey, this is GameStop. Your copy of Fallout 4 you ordered has arrived from the warehouse. You can come by and pick it up anytime. We're open till 9 p.m. today." "Ah, thank you," I responded in a confused fashion. I started answering more calls, my cell phone being bombarded with one new number after another. Perplexed would be an understatement with which to describe my mind at that point in time. Each phone call was from a different GameStop, at least a dozen or so from across the country, calling to tell me I had a copy of Fallout 4 ready for pickup. At this point, I was more frustrated than confused. I assumed my friend was playing some sort of prank at my expense. I eventually began blocking the numbers as they came in. Despite knowing where the calls were more than likely coming from, something about the ordeal wasn't sitting well with me. To make matters worse, something far more peculiar happened upon opening the door to my home. I didn't walk through the doorway, not in the slightest. As soon as the front door opened, I found myself sitting on my bed, controller in hand, looking directly at my TV screen. It's tough for me to explain, but it felt as if I never left the house. The game itself was still running, stopped right where I left off, the word "end" plastered across the terminal screen, and yet again multiplied rapidly. I shot up from my bed and unplugged both my television and PlayStation. I looked up and noticed something. Everything in the room was just how I left it, but the walls were undoubtedly different. The word "end" surrounded the perimeter of my bedroom, written in all different colors and sizes. At first, I was outraged, wondering who had broken into my home and vandalized my room. I thought it might have been my friend, pulling out all the stops to severely spook me. If so, it was working. This explanation fell flat when I realized that the word painted across my room was written in my own handwriting. But hold on, how does this make any sense? A harmless glitch, hallucinations, and writing on the walls. What does it all mean? Well, at this point, I wasn't sure, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. Without a better plan in mind, I decided to go directly to the source, Todd Howard himself. And this is what brought me to a room full of boisterous clamor, waiting for the presentation to be over. I grew anxious sitting there, hoping I could speak with Mr. Howard. I didn't know what he'd say or if he even believed me, but I was a slave to my own wishful thinking. Perhaps he could explain all my worries away and put my mind at ease once and for all. Unfortunately for me, my issues couldn't be fixed with a patch or update. My heart was racing. There finally came a time when everyone left their seats. My legs were shaking, but that was mostly from sitting for such a long period of time. Just as I was about to stumble through the exit and head backstage, a man grabbed me by the arm and pulled me aside. It was none other than Todd Howard, an answer to my prayers. "About time, sir. We've been expecting you," he exclaimed. "You have? Of course, I've been waiting for you to get the hint. To finally come join us. Just please don't tell anybody, he replied. Join you for what? I'm gathering a number of people to help us at Bethesda start a doomsday plan. I'm not at liberty to say why you or any of the others were chosen, but I can tell you that we are using Fallout as a net to capture those that can be of use to us. It also foreshadows what the world will look like in the near future. That's if, of course, you and the others are willing to join us. We can't do it on our own. What would happen, hypothetically speaking, if I didn't join? Well, you're free to do whatever you'd like, but the end has already begun. If you don't help us, someone will take your place, and I just know that you'll regret it. The clock is ticking. Mr. Howard handed me a business card, upon which was the text, "Pre-register for your spot on the end list today," along with a 1-800 number. I took the card and went back to my hotel room to get some rest and process everything. It'd be a nice way to relax and hopefully cope with the strange events occurring in my life. I would soon find that relaxation was nowhere within reach. Upon entering my room, anger and disorientation came over me. The TV in the hotel room was lit up with a copy of Fallout 4 playing. It was stuck on the same screen with the word "end" typed all over it, just as it was back on that November day. As if this wasn't enough, my phone rang, though this time at a number I recognized. "Hey Dad, what's up?" I answered, as I normally do when my father calls. "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you during your trip, but I have some upsetting news to share with you. Your brother just passed away a few moments ago." "Wait, what? How?" I shouted out of shock and despair. I was never close to my brother, with him always being away at war and whatnot. It sounds horrible, but it felt like he was more of a distant relative than a sibling. Even still, my heart sank. The nurses aren't completely certain, but they claim radiation poisoning was at fault. I find that questionable because no bombs have been dropped near his location. They're going to do a further analysis in the coming week to let us know. I'll be back in town as soon as possible. Please keep me updated if any other information comes up. I'm not sure how to handle this. I was just talking to him a couple days ago. I let out a single tear of pure grief. I will, son. This is just as hard for me, and I'll be devastated for as long as this world lasts. He'll be looking down on us, smiling. At least he's in a better place. My father said this in a tone of hurt and heartache. He then changed the subject, probably to lighten the mood a bit, something he awkwardly did to avoid dealing with more serious issues. "Hey, by the way, I have a piece of mail I found stuck in my door tonight, which is pretty odd for a Sunday. It has my name on it, but I think it's for you. It says something about a Fallout 76 beta invitation and has the word "end" written all over it. Do you want it?" I hung up on my own father. I'm not sure why or how I found myself in this ongoing nightmare, but it feels like I'm trapped in my own apocalypse. Take these words however you'd like. Believe what you want. But Bethesda is not a game company. Todd Howard is up to something. And this is the start of the end. Daniel Warrington leaped to his feet. The fire roared and crackled in the hearth, and the wind gusted outside. For a second, he doubted whether he had really heard it. A second, heavier crash, like a great clap of thunder, swiftly relieved him of such foolish notions. He rushed across the drawing room, his plush burgundy smoking jacket billowing out behind him, shoving aside an armchair in his haste, and emerged into the entrance hall to see the stout oak doors rattling in their frame. He snatched the Sharps Model 1874 from its stand above the fireplace and dashed across the brilliant marble floor, feeding a new cartridge from the stash in the pocket of his smoking jacket into the chamber. Too late, he flung open the doors only to catch the briefest glimpse of an immense bulk retreating into the circle of trees. He returned his attention to the doors. Deep gouges in the wood, the lower panels splintered and dented. He slammed his fist against the doorframe in frustration, ignoring the hot lance of pain that pierced his hand. Daniel Warrington had had enough. This was the third incident of its kind to occur since his taking up residence at Night Hill Manor 2 months earlier. Pausing only to pull on a pair of worn leather boots and a dimmer brown scarf, he considered rousing his manservant, Dunwald Marston, to accompany him, but decided against the idea. The old man was probably tucked up in bed by now. There was no reason to disturb him. Whatever it was that walked the woods of Beaumont Chase and menaced the manor, Daniel Warrington would deal with it himself. After all, hadn't he faced down enormous black bears during his months on the continent, looked death in the sharp yellow eyes deep within Peruvian rainforests, and slain a great white lion, king of the African plains, with nothing but a blade in his bare hands? Determined and resolute, Daniel Warrington strode out to meet the night. The air was frozen and the skies were empty. Before him at the clearing's edge loomed the woods, a vast black wall of frostbitten limbs and flaking bark. The wind, at least it was probably the wind, howled between the slender trunks and seethed in the clusters of tall, dark pines. Pale icicles, thin and crooked like skeletal fingers, scintillated as Christmas baubles hung from a tree, a black, dead tree. As he crossed the clearing, his hand fell to the lee-mat belted at his hip. Deemed far too superfluous and unreliable for field use by the U.S. Army, he had managed to procure one of the few remaining prototypes from a customs officer up in Birmingham. In addition to the revolver and the sharps, he carried a long, thick knife with an elaborate deer-bone handle sheathed at his waist, a gift from an elderly knife maker by the name of James Black several years previous. The blade had since tasted the blood of almost every animal that walked, crawled, or swam upon the face of the earth. Regretting not taking the time to change out of his smoking jacket, Daniel Warrington gritted his teeth and trudged on through the biting cold. Tracking the mysterious beast was proving to be exceedingly difficult. Having neglected in his haste to bring a lantern, it was all he could do to discern the sporadic trail of odd hoof-like prints. Their distinctive cleft, although somewhat more pronounced, reminded him of the tracks of the curious black and white striped deer that ran freely across the African plains, with but a single difference. These were sunk far too deeply in the snow, incongruous with the weight of such an animal. Whatever the beast was, it was of the most prodigious size. For minutes that dragged on like hours, he plodded onwards by the sickly light of the moon, the only sound being that of fresh snow crunching beneath his boots. The wind nipped cruelly at his exposed face and hands, bringing with it a faint mist that flowed around him in shreds and tatters, snatching at his clothing with ghostly, insubstantial fingers. His every breath fogged the air with an ephemeral white cloud and seemed to draw the seeping chill ever deeper into his body. Something moved in the outer darkness of his periphery. By the time he had leveled the sharps, it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. The darkness was enfolding now, a great all-encompassing blackness held at bay only by thin shafts of moonlight. A branch snapped to his right, and he whirled in time to see a dislodged clump of snow thud to the ground. Taking a deep breath, he once again leveled the shards. His mind was calm and still, a vast frozen lake in midwinter's grasp. The weight of the stock in the hollow of his shoulder felt good. It felt right. It had been far too long since he'd seen the spark of life fade from the eyes of a dying animal. Slowly, cautiously now, he picked his way between peeling silver birches and over the fallen trunks of once magnificent oaks. Alert to even the smallest motion, he hunted in silence, pressing onward into the woods, deeper than ever before. Eventually the tracks halted at a great twisted snarl of brambles, stretching taller than a man. There was no sign of his quarry passing through, and truly, the tracks continued in no other direction. Fighting back disquiet at the idea of an animal so large capable of clearing such a barrier with a single leap, Daniel Warrington slung the sharps over his back and unsheathed his knife. He would need to act swiftly now. Stumbling forth from a narrow tunnel of thorns and tangles, Daniel Warrington emerged into a misty clearing, damp from the moisture in the air. Lank locks of hair clung to his forehead. His face and hands were sliced in several places, and his smoking jacket was all but ruined. Dunwald Marston would not be amused. He straightened and unslung the sharps, taking stock of his surroundings. The wall of brambles encircled the entire clearing, and it appeared he had forced his way through at one of the lowest points. In places, the brambles grew around the overhanging branches of nearby trees, crawling along their drooping limbs like sinister barbed snakes. All across the clearing, spires of rock jutted upward from the mists, their twisted points scraping the colliginous skies. Small, trembling gouts of white had begun to spiral down, but Daniel Warrington barely noticed. His attention was elsewhere. It was not often that Daniel Warrington found himself at a loss for words. Now he could barely remember to breathe. Dominating the center of the clearing and towering over its surroundings was a dark cyclopean monolith of impossibly immense proportions. Plainly visible upon its surface were an array of nightmarish bas-reliefs, upon which the gibbous moon shone sickeningly. Thin tendrils of mist curled up and around the hideous obelisk, crashing against its sides like churning ethereal waves. Mother Nature took a deep breath, and the night itself fell still. Deep within the mists, something moved. Clack, clack, clack. He could feel it now. The beast's eyes were upon him. The fine, downy hairs on the back of his neck stood erect, and his skin rippled with gooseflesh. Clack, clack, clack. The sound echoed hollowly across the clearing. He sighted down the barrel of the sharps and willed his trembling hands to still. Shifting anxiously beneath the gaze of that loathsome monolith, he watched and waited. Clack, clack, clack. The stag shambled forth from the swirling mists. A blackened crown of jagged antlers twisting in all directions adorned its head. As the beast sauntered past the monolith, the tips of those dreadful antlers screeched across the black stone. The sharps dropped from Daniel Warrington's shaking hands, clattering away across the ground. The stag's jaw lolled wide, revealing a maw bulging with pointed yellow teeth, akin to those of the sleek tiger-striped sharks of the West Pacific. Only now did he understand the truly monstrous proportions of the beast. Its head stood fully twice the height of a man, above which loomed the terrible antlers. The monster's snout glistened wetly in the waxing moonlight, and its tattered fur seemed to crawl and shift as though it were a living carpet of chitinous beetles. Patches of yellowing bone shone through its coat. Fur and skin clung to its forelegs in patches, like moss to the trunk of a rotten tree. Dark rivulets of blood trickled from the hollows of the beast's eyes, a pair of vast, empty holes in which green flames guttered and billowed. The stag snorted, stamping its foot with a sharp crack like a gunshot, causing a murder of sleek black crows to erupt in flight from a nearby tree. Coils of mist drifted lazily around the beast, never quite coming close enough to touch its slick black fur. Its hooves were bloody bone, heavy enough to crush a man's skull to dust beneath their tread. And then it spoke, a guttural, rasping sound abhorrent to the minds of men. At this, some hidden string, pulled taut in fear, finally snapped, and the lemat leaped into Daniel Warrington's hand, as if it had been there all along. He flipped the lever on the end of the hammer up, causing the striker to fall upon the primer set directly below it. The stag let out a monstrous bellow, lowered its head, and charged. Daniel Warrington took careful aim, drawing a bead atop the beast's skull. The stag roared, as did the lemat. The blast of buckshot from the revolver's secondary barrel disintegrated the top of the stag's head. Something coiled and dark pulsated amidst the ruin of its skull, shifting and oozing against the splintered bone. The beast hardly faltered. Daniel Warrington could only stare, horrified. As the wound immediately began to heal, his bones were forming before his very eyes. The skin, however, remained absent, and he at once understood the significance of the many bald patches speckling the creature's hide. How many before him had tried and failed to slay this dark, majestic horror? Razor-sharp antlers gored his stomach, and then he was tumbling across the frosted earth towards the monolith. He pressed a hand to his stomach and felt what seemed to be a handful of snakes squirming against his palm. Blood seeped between his fingers. Clack, clack, clack. The stag towered over him now, whispering the blasphemous insanities of the old gods who dwelt beneath the earth, deep down in the seas, and in the dark, forgotten places of the world where the stars had never shone. Dreadful images began to form in his mind of nameless monstrosities uncoiling beneath the earth and Polyphemus-like creatures emerging from the oceans. The insignificance of man crashed down upon him, followed momentarily by the stag's hoof, which fell with a sickening crunch, the splitting of a ripe melon. Daniel Warrington thought no more. Dunwald Marston sat in the darkened library, reading by the guttering flame of a candle burnt nearly down to the stump, a leather-bound tome of substantial thickness, The Midwinter World. But the book was Midwinter World in name only. The cover concealed a far more sinister tome, one that had previously resided for many years under lock and key in a sub-basement of the British Museum, hidden by fools who possessed neither the strength of mind nor the courage to conquer the horrors bound within the book's wafer-thin pages. From the walls of the room, glassy eyes reflected the candlelight, inch-long yellowing fangs frozen in snarls of anger and roars of defiance. It sundered Dunwald's heart to see such beautiful, magnificent creatures murdered for the cruel sport of a single man. His gaze wandered to the umbrella stand in the far corner, fashioned from the foot of a majestic white rhino, and he felt the familiar fires of hatred flare up in his chest. That Warrington had the nerve and the gall to slaughter even a single one of Duzu's precious children grated on Dunwald's very sense of being. Well, it would not happen again. Ishmael would see to that. Thin, wavering shafts of moonlight filtered through the picture window, picking out every scar and crag on Dunwald's tanned, calloused hands, the hands of one who has spent a lifetime in the wilderness, wandering the secret, untamed places of the earth. The book at his fingertips remained dim and dark, the light itself refusing to touch such blasphemous pages. This suited Dunwald perfectly. Some things were born only to dwell in darkness. Dunwald drew the flickering candle closer, leant forward, and continued to read. From the earth where groweth dark wood, into any time when the rites are spoken, can the holder of the knowledge summon the walker, child of great Duzu, he who dwelleth in the vast wilderness, between the worlds and eath the soul and flesh of man, he that roams when the moon waxes yellow, and is called Ishmael. Only in supplication to the walker of the worlds between can one escape the wrath of Duzu. Frank, Thomas, and Kirby enter the office break room at approximately 12:25 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Each man holds various containers designed for holding food and drink, and as they lazily slump into the fiberglass chairs that were haphazardly pushed under the table after their previous uses, the room echoes of violent thwop pops and elongated scrogips as Tupperware lids fly open and Velcro bags release their treasures. God damn it. Thomas rolls his eyes. Frank, with a mouth full of cold pizza, mumbles in empathy, "Wife, pack your tuna salad again, huh?" Thomas tosses the soggy sandwich down onto the table with a resounding glop. She knows I hate this stuff. I swear, I've almost reached my breaking point with this asterisk. Why don't you just pack your own lunch? Kirby attempts to speak through teeth caked with salad. A drip of ranch dressing falls from Kirby's lip and collides with the table. Thomas just glares at Kirby in disdain. You don't get it, man. I've told her, like 50 times. I don't like tuna salad, but does she listen? No. Thomas raises his right hand to his forehead. I swear, I'm up to here with this. Well, at least you're not like that one guy. Frank wipes his mouth with a cheap paper napkin. What one guy? Thomas looks at Frank in slight confusion. You talking about that guy from CompuTools? I heard about it on the news last week. Kirby chimes in. He has already begun digging into his pudding cup. Thomas spins around to Kirby and asks, What the hell are you guys talking about? Frank wipes off his hands with another napkin, folds his hands in front of him, and leans in quietly. Thomas and Kirby follow suit. You see, there was this guy over at CompuTools. Nice guy, I hear. What was his name? Frank concentrates on the ceiling, searching for a name. Suddenly, Frank snaps his fingers and says, Phil Curbson. Anyway, he was one of those diligent workers who never complained and always got his work done before the deadline. Hell, he would even stay late to make sure that his perfect record was never tarnished. Thomas chimed in. Ugh, I hate those guys. Well, supposedly, CompuTools hired this new hotshot manager. Basic ROTC'd up from corporate, you know. Never lifted a finger in his life and got to skip right to the front. Thomas shook his head. Exactly. So this guy was brought in to Frank, who raised his finger and said, help. And since this douche really didn't know anything about CompuTools products, he would just bark orders and micromanage everyone. Everyone in the office was buzzing. We're going to quit. Let's get HR involved. This guy is completely heartless. The usual empty water cooler promises. Everyone was in a tiff, except for Phil. Phil would mind his own business and do his work with a silent smile. He would even go as far as asking this new manager, anything else I can do to help? Well, I don't know if that manager deliberately planned to be this malicious or if it was just common nature for him, but he got this notion in his head to see how far he could bend Phil until he broke. Starting the very next day, the manager threw the biggest workflow onto Phil's desk and barked out, I need this done by 5 o'clock today, or you can just pack your shit now, or something to that effect. Phil quietly turned to face the manager, smiled his calm, innocent smile, and said, Sure thing, boss. 5 o'clock rolls around, and Phil walks into the manager's office and proudly places the completed report on the man's desk. Here you go, boss. The manager looked up from polishing and buffing his prized 600-pound marble desk to the completed pile of papers with a look of complete shock. How could one man complete that report in only 7.5 short hours? His eyes then shifted from the report to glare viciously at Phil's calm, lucid face. Anything else I can do to help? Smiled Phil. The manager simply shook his head in disbelief. Oak, well, I'm going to head out for the day, sir. You have yourself a great evening. The manager was flabbergasted. He steeled his motives and vowed that he would try harder to break this man's spirit by the end of the week. Well, the end of the week came and went, and still Phil was as cheerful as ever, always responding to every outrageous task with a happy, sure thing, and then turning in the completed work to the manager at the end of the day with a pleasant, anything else I can do to help? Well, this went on for a few weeks, and the manager, now seeing that current efforts were fruitless, decided that maybe he needed to up the ante. The manager would now bombard Phil with major accounts, lengthy business trips, and tedious conferences, all to quell his passion that Phil must be broken. But with every new and more difficult task, Phil would embrace it with a sure thing, boss, and come back for more with a sunny anything else I can do to help. The manager, now at his wit's end, had one more trick up his sleeve. Although his lack of concentration on the job he was hired for was beginning to come under fire, he wanted to give it one more shot before he himself had to face the firing squad. He got it in his head that it was the breaks in between each 8-hour day that were allowing Phil to wind down, regain his bearings, get a good night's sleep, and come back the next day ready for more. So with that in mind, he gave Phil the budget report for the following year and told him, I don't care how long it takes, but you cannot leave your desk until we trim at least $5 million off of next year's budget. As always, Phil replied with his trademark, Sure thing, boss. The manager turned away, knowing that this task would be Phil's breaking point. And like clockwork, Phil came into the manager's office with the completed budget and handed it to him. Anything else I can do to help? The manager looked over the budget and said, I really don't like these numbers. The manager threw the report back at Phil. Do it all over, and this time, do it right. Phil's smile sagged a little, but he soon rebounded, turned around, and headed back to his desk. The manager saw Phil's smile buckle for just a moment, and he chuckled to himself that his plan was finally working. 8 o'clock rolls around, and Phil returns back to the manager's office. But Phil looks a bit different. His hair was a bit disheveled. His horn-rimmed glasses are now on his forehead. One corner of his shirt has become untucked from his pants. Phil's stride isn't as carefree. Phil hands the report to the manager and exasperatedly utters, "Anything else I can do to help, sir?" The manager, now seeing victory close at hand, looks at the report and says, Phil, I think you made some miscalculations here." The manager hands the report back to Phil. "Do it again, and remember what I said. You stay until it's complete." Phil, dejected, defeated, and disappointed, looked at the report in his hands, wiped the sweat from his brow, and scratched the back of his neck. The nearly broken man headed back to his desk to correct his errors. As soon as Phil left his office, the manager closed the door and danced a twisted victory dance. Phil was nearly gone. The manager was going to sleep well that night. At 11 o'clock, Phil trudged back into the manager's office and handed him the completed and corrected report. Exhausted, Phil asked, "Is there anything else I can do to help, sir?" The manager, now a shining example of pure arrogance, threw the report on the floor and exclaimed, "Why did you do the budget for next year? I asked you to do the budget for this year. Can't you even follow simple instructions? I want you to march back to your pathetic little queue, and you are going to stay all night in your have-to until you do exactly what I ask you to do, or so help me, God, I will find someone else who can do it." Now, no one knows exactly what happened next, but some of the late-night stragglers who heard the manager's tirade claimed that as soon as he was finished, Phil took off his glasses, cleaned them off with the corner of his shirt that was still untucked, put his glasses back on, and closed all of the blinds in the manager's office that faced the rest of the room. What came from the room after that was a thunderous crash and a high-pitched shriek. The door flew open, and the manager bolted out of the room with glass shards in his hair, bleeding profusely from his face, screaming, "K-L-C-Q-R-I-T! Call C-Q-R-I-T!" Witnesses then claimed that they saw Phil calmly walk out of the office, his shirt and hands splattered with blood. He held a letter opener in his right hand, now stained with blood. Phil's calm and happy expression was lost to a visage one person could only describe as berserk. Phil's brow furrowed, scrunching his eyebrows into a wide arch. His teeth gnarled, and, according to one person, appeared sharp and pointed. His skin, once pale and fair, is now red and scaly. His slick hair now flailed wildly about his head and danced to its own accord. Phil marched towards the cowering manager. "Sure thing, sure thing, sure thing." Phil continued to chant these two words over and over, and the volume of his voice continued to climb until he was shrieking. Phil destroyed everything in his path to get to the manager, who was now scrambling for the elevator. He turned over cubicle walls, hurled the office printer, and overturned desks, but he was still marching at a steady pace. Not once did Phil's gait increase in speed. The elevator doors finally opened, and the manager quickly darted inside. And as he was frantically pounding on the door close button, Phil's arm thrust inside the cabin as the doors were closing. The manager let out a girlish cry for help. And then Thomas, now sitting on the edge of his seat, blinked. "Yeah." "Well," Frank continued, "security hauled him away. The folks that stuck around for the whole ordeal say that they've never heard Phil use any profanity, ever. But on that day, they heard curse words so vile that they almost sounded like they were in some form of ancient tongue, some demonic language. Only by the grace of God was security able to restrain Phil." As the paddy wagon rolled up into the office building drive, witnesses noticed three things. First, Phil was kicking and screaming the entire time and was hardly recognizable. Second, the manager couldn't stop crying. And thirdly, and the most bizarre, was that they realized what caused the thunderous crash in the manager's office. The 600-pound marble desk, the manager's prized possession, now lay in pieces outside the office window. So that's it. What happened after that? There had to have been a trial. Thomas exclaimed. Oh, there was a trial. But Phil was deemed mentally unstable to serve a trial, so he was committed to the state hospital over in Brookfield. And everything died down and returned to normal. The manager was brought in to see corporate, and he was actually let go because not only did the security cameras record what Phil did to the manager and the office, but they also recorded the manager's outburst on Phil that caused him to snap in the first place. Just desserts, I say. Thomas commented. Kirby just shook his head as he started to clean up his empty containers. Well, here's the real punchline. And this I got from Sally Boyd over there at CompuTools. She used to be the manager's admin. After the manager was let go, he was cleaning out his temporary desk, and to pass the time, he had the radio on. The manager left his office for a moment to get some more boxes. As he returned to his office, she heard on the radio that Phil Curbson, who was committed to Brookfield State Hospital on Monday, was discovered missing from his cell earlier today. The manager froze in horror, and as Sally turned around to see the manager's expression, the door violently slammed in her face, knocking her backward onto the ground. As she recovered from her fall, she told me that she could clearly hear the manager pleading for his life. She distinctly heard, "Please, don't. I'll do anything you want." And then, a familiar calm and soothing voice came from behind the door. "Anything I can do to help." Sally pounced for the door, but it was locked. She tried to look through the window, but the blinds were mostly drawn, so she only saw the flailing of arms and legs. Sally kicked at the door repeatedly and shouted, "Somebody, please help." But it was too late. As soon as the commotion ceased from inside the office, Sally heard the knob clicked to signal that it had been unlocked. With tears in her eyes, she slowly reached for the knob and opened the door to reveal a gruesome scene. The manager splayed open from his throat to his pelvis, rib cage, and organs exposed. His hands twisted into contorted knots of flesh and knuckles. His face warped into an expression of unrelenting anguish and fear, eyes wide, jaw locked, and nose broken and twisted. In his left hand, its last cadence drawing to a close, was the manager's own heart. Sally and some of the onlookers who had finally gained access to the room then looked up to see the following message scrawled on the bare, dingily yellow office wall. "We were wrong. He had a heart after all." Jesus. Thomas had to hold back the vomit by covering his mouth. After that, CompuTools shut down that office. I think they turned it into a megabuy. Frank finished his tale with a solemn sip of coffee. Thomas rubbed his eyes. Whoa, wait a minute. Whatever happened to Phil? This is when I'm supposed to say, that's the strange thing. But it's not really that strange. When they finally opened up the office, the only person in there was the manager. Sally even said she never actually saw Phil. She only heard his voice, or at least what sounded like his voice. And he hasn't been seen since. That story's complete bullshit, Kirby exclaimed. Frank and Thomas spun around to glare at Kirby for breaking the mood. What? Thomas inquired, as if you know exactly what happened. I just know that that's not how it happened. Kirby calmly stated this as he adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses. Okay, hotshot. How do you know? Frank jested because. Kirby leaned in close. Frank and Thomas matched Kirby's movement. The hospital doesn't know I'm gone yet. Just then, Kirby's manager leans into the break room. Hey Kirb, I need you to do something for me. Sure thing, boss. As Kirby stands up to leave the now broken room, Frank and Thomas glance down at Kirby's security badge for his full name, Kirby Phillips. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do was stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it for the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the fourth day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We have conversations, or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling, or breakdancing, or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second, and I realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. You're using the thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out conversations with him. And no one was wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, but he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I'd thought the date I brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes, leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them. But I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered it, and he came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulpa grew suddenly furious. "Hit him," it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down in my apartment. I was more furious then than I have ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me off with a warning. My tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he'd goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time. But every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, and his teeth were more pointed. He hissed, gibbered, threatened, and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him. And there he'd be, and that howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressive men grabbed and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted. His eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but he hunched over. His hands were twisted, and the fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed in my restraints as best I could, but I could hardly move at all. "They're pumping you full of gooch asterisk, I think. How's the mind?" "All fuzzy." He leaned closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes they left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat, and her blood showered on me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, and demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it may have just been more delusion, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one, and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times and mocked me at others. Another thing that I prayed for was a delusion. He could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once, he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have a scar. Most days I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A querulous look crossed his face, and he reached out and touched my head. Like my mother used to when I was feverish, he stayed still for a long moment, and then smiled. All thoughts are creative, he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, took a long shower, and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day or the one after that. It was over. I'd spent a week locked in that room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback, shrieking, and a modem dialing up. I hear it still. A little louder now. Oh boy. I'm not really sure how to properly start these types of stories, but I'm going to try to get to the point as fast as possible. See, I'm kind of on a timer here. I'm currently writing this on one of the computers in the library of my college. As I type, I feel like I'm being watched from the shadows. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to get this story out somehow. Nobody here will believe anything I say. I'm falling behind on all of my schoolwork to the point where I might be put on academic probation. I also got fired from my part-time job because I was scaring the customers. Anyway, I want to at least do something so I can tell myself this was all worth it. Even still, it might not even matter in the end. Last year, I met a guy named Jack Driscoll. He was a pretty chill dude for the most part, and we actually became pretty good friends. My name is Ethan, by the way, and I'm currently finishing up my senior year in college. Well, I'm trying to finish up my senior year. Anyway, as I was saying, Jack and I started to become good friends after we found out we were pretty much into all of the same stuff. We both liked the same types of video games, the same movie genres, and even had the same taste in clothes. I had other friends, sure, but nobody was interested in the same things I was. Sadly, this all changed last winter. Advertisements. Jack started hanging out with a girl from one of our classes named Elisa. It wasn't long before he asked her out, and the two became an item. At first, I was happy for him. He never had the best luck with the ladies, so it was nice to see him with someone who genuinely liked him. We would all hang out from time to time, and she came off as a really nice girl. Hell, I even found myself getting a little jealous. About a month into their relationship, I noticed things started to change. Jack would stop hanging out with his friends and spend more time with Elisa. At first, I figured this was normal. A lot of people will want to spend more time with their significant other, and there really isn't anything wrong with that. I'd still see him, and we'd play video games online together after class, so I didn't think too much of it. Then things started to get weird. One morning, the two of us were waiting in line at the cafeteria. The food at our school wasn't the best, but it was fine for what it was. We got there a little late, so the line was already pretty long, but nothing we weren't used to. Guess we should have gotten here earlier, huh? I laughed. Jack didn't say anything. Hey, buddy, are you still asleep? I joked as I nudged his shoulder. Shut up, he murmured. I was taken aback by his response since he sounded genuinely angry. I'm only joking, I explained. Did you not get enough sleep last night or what? This line is too fucking long. I need to get out of here. Some of the other students have started staring at us now. Jack realized this and turned around. You got a problem, he yelled at one of the girls behind us. The girl froze and grabbed her friend's hand. Dude, what the hell? Calm down. I yelled back. I had no idea why he was acting like this. It wasn't like him at all. Jack didn't say a word. Instead, he just turned toward the door and ran out of the building. After that incident, I didn't talk to him. I did try to get his attention in class for a while, but it was no use. After a few days, I stopped trying altogether. After a week, Jack stopped showing up to class. One night, I ran into Elisa in the hallway. I was done with classes for the day and was ready to head back to my apartment. Hey, Elisa, I said with a smile. Oh, hi, Ethan, she said, smiling back. For some reason, her smile sent a chill down my spine. Why did she seem so happy when her boyfriend was clearly not doing well? I adjusted my backpack before I spoke again. So what's up with Jack? Is he okay? Elisa looked up, almost like she was thinking of the answer to a math problem. She turned back to me and answered cheerfully. He's perfectly fine, she said with a grin. He's actually better than ever. Oh, okay, I said, clearly unconvinced. Well, in that case, could you tell him that? Better than ever. She interrupted. This startled me. I wasn't sure why, but something about his girl suddenly felt sinister. She walked away, leaving me standing there in my confusion. I snapped out of the weird trance I was in. This is stupid, I thought to myself. I'll just try calling him again. I had called him before but stopped trying when I was convinced he wouldn't pick up. That night, I decided to call him up and ask if I could come over. To my surprise, he answered immediately. Yo, Jack answered. Hey man, what's up? I asked. What do you want? Is everything okay with you? You've seemed off lately. Silence. Hello. Are you home? Yeah, I'm coming over. After Jack told me he was on his way, the call ended. I'm not going to lie. I was pretty scared. The tone of his voice sounded panicked, almost like he was trying to get out of whatever situation he was in. About 45 minutes after the phone call, I heard a knock at my door. Hey, I said as I greeted Jack at the door, "What's up?" I tried to remain as calm as possible. It was obvious once I saw him that something was seriously wrong with the guy. "I don't know," he whispered as his eyes darted back and forth. "Are you alone?" I nodded my head and let the poor guy in. He sat down on the old couch I had set up in front of the TV. My roommates were out for the night, so I wasn't really worried about anyone coming back anytime soon. "Dude, what is going on with you? Turn off the lights." I froze for a minute. "Jack, you're scaring me." "What's?" "Turn off the lights. She can't find me." I did as I was told. This was turning out to be worse than I thought. "Are you talking about Elisa?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Did she do something to you?" Jack didn't answer. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Dude, I want to help you. But there's nothing I can do if I don't know what's going on." Jack was violently tapping his fingers on his legs. He continued to stare at the ground as he answered me. "There's something wrong with her, man," he whimpered. "I think she's, like, part of a cult." I raised my eyebrows. I could tell he was scared. But this was a little much. Even still, she must have done something pretty messed up to him for Jack to think this way. "Why do you say that?" I asked. "Also, have you asked anyone for help? If she's scaring you that badly, you know you can go to the police, right?" "I can't." He jerked his head to face me, and I almost threw up. Jack was crying, but his tears were black. I thought I was seeing things at first since the lights were off, but he confirmed my suspicions with what he said next. "She did this to me. I don't know how, but I know it was her." He continued to cry, the black liquid staining the couch cushions like ink. "The other night, she caught me crying these gross fucking tears and said that I was ready. What the fuck is that supposed to mean?" I didn't know how to answer him. This was totally beyond my realm of understanding, and I knew there was nothing I could say that would give him any relief. "We'll figure something out," I said after about a minute of total silence. "But we should call the police. You should also go to the hospital. Whatever is going on with your eyes can't be good and needs to be looked at." Jack wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. "She can't find me," he said, calming down a little. "If she finds me, I'll—" Jack fell silent as we heard a soft knock at my front door. "Jackie, I know you're in there." It was a girl's voice. "It's time to go. They're waiting for us. Your friend can come too if he wants to." Jack sprung up from the couch, ran towards the back door, and disappeared into the woods behind my apartment. "Jack, wait," I yelled. It was useless. I raced after my friend while dialing 911 on my cell. I told the police what was happening, and they assured me officers would be on their way as soon as they could. Before I could respond, something hit me over the head, and I blacked out. What happened next still seems like a horrible nightmare, but I know what I saw was real. When I eventually came, I was tied to a tree trunk. There were several figures standing in a circle around another figure who was strapped to a chair. As my vision returned, I could see that each figure was wearing a long black robe and a blue mask. I focused on the figure in the chair. It was Jack. I tried to scream, but my mouth was taped shut. I finally came to the horrid conclusion that I was not only present in the middle of a cult meeting, but I was about to witness a human sacrifice. One of the cultists walked toward Jack and lifted his mask. It was Elisa. Grabbing his chin, she pulled his face close to hers and gave him a kiss. He pulled back and began swearing at the girl. I didn't blame him. I had a couple of things I wanted to say myself but couldn't due to my own restraints. Another taller cultist began to read from an old-looking black book. As he read, a number of other cultists swarmed Jack like hungry vultures. One cultist taped his mouth shut while two held down his chair. I watched in horror as a fourth cultist pulled out a rusty-looking tool. The cultist plunged the tool into each of Jack's eyes, slowly tearing them out. The blood that rushed from his eye sockets appeared thick now, like tar. To finish it off, the cultist who had taken Jack's eyes fixed a blue mask on his face. He was still alive, but for how much longer, I had no idea. As the one cultist kept reading from the book, the ground beneath Jack began to tremble. Black tendrils sprouted up like demonic weeds. Some of the tendrils wrapped around his waist, others around his ankles, and one even plunged itself down his throat. I was beginning to pass out. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. This caused the cultist who was reading to stop. "What are you doing, you idiot?" one of the other cultists screamed. "If you stop now, he'll..." The ground stopped shaking, and the tendrils retreated back to whatever hell they came from. Everyone went silent. The cultists all seemed to freeze, and for a moment, almost looked like statues. The silence was soon broken by faint, sinister laughter coming from Jack. "You made him mad," Jack hissed. These were the last words I ever heard my friend say. I watched him break free from his bonds like they were nothing. Jack charged each cultist, tearing them apart and splattering their entrails all over the frost-covered ground. My vision started to go, and the sounds of the screaming cultists seemed to fade into the distance. I only wish I had totally passed out before hearing that horrible crunching. The sound of bones breaking and organs being devoured. My former friend was eating his captors, and I was sure I would be next. I woke up to a police officer shining a light in my face. "He's up. Quick. We need a paramedic over here." I sat up and looked around. "I'm alive," I mumbled, still in a haze. "I know you just went through some shit, kid, but is there anything you can tell us about what happened?" The officer asked. "Leave him alone," another officer ordered. "We can question him after we get him out of this hellhole." "The kid's got a massive cut on his side." "Right. Sorry, kid." I looked down and noticed my shirt was soaked in my own blood. I couldn't feel anything due to my current state, but it looked bad. I didn't speak the entire way to the hospital. I didn't know what to say. Things got even worse when the doctor told me that while I would survive, I was missing one of my kidneys. It's been a little over a year now since this all went down. Everyone has already heard about it on the news, and the school came under some heavy fire for not noticing something this big happening near their campus. Jack Driscoll is still missing and is currently responsible for the murders of 10 students and the attempted murder of one. I've gone on for long enough at this point. I guess I just really needed to get it all out somehow. I still don't know what the cult was for, why it was formed, or what it was trying to summon. Obviously, nobody will look into this further because it sounds too ridiculous, but I'm hoping someone reading this will. If not, then, I guess, just be careful. You can't trust everyone after all.